Support for this episode comes from Dexcom. If your doctor wants you to check your glucose using finger sticks, ask them about using a Dexcom G7 continuous glucose monitoring system instead. Dexcom G7 is a glucose sensor that sits just beneath the skin, allowing users to check blood glucose without pricking a finger. It provides key trends data that gives users and their health professionals the knowledge to adjust diet or medication. Dexcom CGM removes the mystery from diabetes. If you need help talking with your doctor about Dexcom CGM, they've got a great discussion guide to help you get started. Find out more. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Today on Diabetes Connections Type 2, it's being called a radical new way to treat diabetes. It's called GEMS, Glucose Everyday Matters, and the National Institutes of Health is giving millions to study it. We're going to talk about it with Dr. Daniel Cox, the UVA researcher who lives with Type 2 and developed it. Let's also talk about insulin resistance. You've probably heard the term, but what does it mean? Can you change it? We're going to lay it out. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Diabetes Connections Type 2. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and I've covered diabetes as a podcaster since 2015 and as a health reporter since the 1990s. And I have heard about a lot of breakthroughs and amazing studies that haven't all panned out. There's a lot of hype out there. This week's subject, GEMS, is an interesting and frankly very simple way to look at diabetes. But that doesn't mean it's easy. I think it's really important to go beyond the headlines when things like this come out, and that's what the show is all about. I want to give you information you can really use. So let's jump in with just a minute of some facts. This week, I want to talk about insulin resistance. This is going to come up in our interview today, so it's a good idea to define it. And for several reasons, your muscle, fat, and liver cells can respond inappropriately to insulin, which means they can't efficiently take up glucose from your blood or store it. That's insulin resistance. As a result, your pancreas makes more insulin to try to overcome your increasing blood glucose levels. As long as your pancreas can keep up and make enough insulin to overcome your cell's weak response, your blood sugar levels will stay in a healthy range. If your cells become too resistant to insulin, though, it leads to elevated blood glucose, which over time leads to prediabetes and type 2. Now, insulin resistance can actually affect anybody. You don't have to have diabetes. It can be temporary. For example, your medications can cause brief periods of this. It can be chronic. And the two main factors that seem to contribute to insulin resistance are excess body fat, especially around the stomach, and a lack of physical activity. But scientists still have a lot to discover about how exactly insulin resistance develops. So far, they've identified several genes that make a person more or less likely to develop insulin resistance, and older people are more prone to it. So eating a more healthy diet, exercising regularly, losing excess weight can increase insulin sensitivity and decrease insulin resistance, but not in everybody, and not all causes are reversible. There's a school of thought that the insulin resistance causes the weight gain and not the other way around. The info here is from the Cleveland Clinic. You can find out more in the show notes. I've got a link, and you can really dive in. And my guest this week is Dr. Daniel Cox from the University of Virginia School of Medicine. He is part of a research team that developed GEMS, and he will explain what that is all about. And I'll tell you, he is looking for people to be part of the ongoing study. I spoke with Dr. Cox before Thanksgiving, and we talked about managing that holiday. I'm keeping that part in, though, because it applies to any big holiday with food or really any big meal. And that's next, right after this. As you'll find out, I'm a huge fan of choice when it comes to diabetes technology. We've come a long way since my son was diagnosed in 2006. And you want a medical supply company that can provide what you want. That's why I'm so excited to partner with US Med. They have whatever you need. They hold the #1 spot as the distributor for Freestyle Libre systems nationwide. They rank #1 in Dexcom customer surveys. They're the top specialty distributor for Omnipod Dash and the fastest growing tandem distributor nationwide. US Med always ensures you have 90 days worth of supplies and provides fast, free shipping to your doorstep. Plus, rest easy knowing they hold an A+ rating with the BBB. US Med, your trusted partner in diabetes care. Your health, satisfaction, and peace of mind are their priority. Find out more. Go to usmed.com/Stacy. That's usmed.com/STACEY. Dr. Cox, thank you so much for jumping on and explaining this. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for asking.
Let's start with kind of an overview, if you don't mind. Tell me what GEMS is all about.
Okay, GEMS stands for Glucose Everyday Matters. And what we're focusing on is your blood glucose and how to control your blood glucose. So whenever you eat nutrients, primarily carbohydrates, your blood glucose shoots up. And if you don't have diabetes, your insulin gets released and brings your blood glucose right down. However, if you have type 2 diabetes, your glucose will continue to rise very high and will keep up there for an extended period of time because your insulin is not very effective at bringing it back down. Now, the problem becomes sustained high blood glucose or hyperglycemia. And sustained blood glucose is somewhat like sustained hypertension or high blood pressure. In the same way that high blood pressure will affect your organ system throughout your body, high blood glucose is toxic to your nervous system and will eventually impact and destroy many of your neural pathways that control your heart, that control your hearing, that control your digestion, that control your sexual functioning. And that's why diabetes, type 2 diabetes, will impact every cell or every organ in your body. And the trick, of course, to prevent those negative consequences is to avoid sustained high blood glucose. Now, this can be done in two ways, one by medication or two by lifestyle interventions. And there are two types of lifestyle interventions. One that focuses on reducing weight. And the reason for that is you reduce your fat in your liver. And that's where the source of insulin resistance resides. However, to make weight loss effective, it has to be significant and it has to be sustained over the lifetime of the disease. That is your own lifetime. So it's not a matter of losing weight. It's a matter of losing weight and keeping it off for the rest of your life.
Yeah, we all know how easy that is.
Yes. And that's why I developed this alternative approach, because when I've been an NIH investigator for the past 35 years, focusing primarily on type 1 diabetes. But in 2010, I developed type 2 diabetes myself. And I wanted to avoid medications if possible. And I knew I was not a good candidate for weight loss for two reasons. One is I wasn't significantly overweight, but two, when I've tried to slim down, I haven't been able to sustain it. So the alternative strategy was, instead of focusing on reducing weight, instead focus on reducing your blood glucose excursions, or how much your blood glucose goes up and how long it stays up.
Before you go further, though, you use that word excursion. Talk about, you mentioned this in the beginning, why it's dangerous, but a little bit about that excursion, why you really want to get those under control.
Okay, so when you eat some carbohydrates, you have insulin. Well, it automatically pushes everybody's blood glucose up. But if you have diabetes, it continues to go up and it stays elevated. And that hyperglycemia is like high blood pressure. It's toxic to the organ system and produces damage in the nerves, which in turn affects a multitude of organ systems. So if you can prevent that blood glucose from going up a lot, or if you can hasten its recovery, then you diminish those excursions, you diminish that toxic state. So everybody, whether you have diabetes or not, the blood glucose goes up. It's just how much it goes up and how long it stays up, which is problematic.
Got it. So the headlines of the stories I was reading about this that led me to ask you to come on the show, most of them used words like unconventional, new treatment. This is new, but it seems pretty simple. Explain what you're doing here.
Exactly. Our motto is to keep things simple, keep things sustainable, keep things safe, keep things successful. And those are the principles that the GEM intervention is based on. We're not selling any drugs or any product whatsoever. What we do is help people keep their blood glucose from going up. And that is learning which carbohydrates push an individual's blood glucose up a lot or a little. And then once they know what foods their body is sensitive to, then they have a choice. They can decide to avoid those foods and keep their blood glucose low, or they can say, it's not worth it to me and I want to go ahead and eat that. So we don't tell people what to do. We just educate people which foods are costly to them in terms of their metabolic control. And then they have a choice whether or not that is important to them to diminish their blood glucose excursions by select food choices.
It's not just about food, though, right? I mean, well, that's a really big component. People in this study did exercise and had some other interactions with medical professionals, things like that.
Exactly. So what happens is, if you think of a curve having two sides, the upside and the downside. Okay. The upside of the curve is driven by carbohydrates, some carbohydrates. The downside of the curve is promoted by physical activity. So, for example, I went out to eat one time and I had zucchini French fries. I thought, oh, those ought to be healthy. But what I didn't appreciate is that these zucchini French fries were breaded. And so I ate my zucchini French fries and I had a blood glucose monitor on. And by the time I got home, I checked my blood glucose and it had jumped about 120 points. And I said, whoa, that's not what I want. So I put on my earphones and took out my iPhone and listened to music. And I took a brisk walk around the neighborhood. And after about 30 minutes, my blood glucose had dropped about 80 points. And I said, oh, this is pretty good. Let me keep going. And then I kept walking. And after 45 minutes, my blood glucose was lower than it was before I started eating those zucchini fries. And so that's the power a person has. You're not a victim of your blood glucose. You can actually reduce it by physical activity. And there's two types of physical activity that's important. One type is just any kind of movement. And movement involves contraction of the skeletal muscles. And the neat thing about skeletal muscles is that they can use glucose without insulin. So whether you're insulin resistant or not, those skeletal muscles are going to suck up your glucose. And that's why, if you walk an hour or two after you eat with the high blood glucose, those muscles are going to take the glucose out of your bloodstream and use it as fuel. That's a great thing.
That's a nice trick.
The second part of moderate to vigorous activity, like jogging, swimming, sustained physical activity, is that it reduces insulin resistance for about 24 to 36 hours, meaning you could eat some high blood glucoses and your insulin will work better at lowering it than it would if you had not. So it's like taking a pill. However, most pills don't last 24 to 36 hours, like the effects of moderate to vigorous activity on your insulin resistance.
You've mentioned a blood glucose monitor. Can you talk a little bit about how that works in GEMS? I mean, I understand you're talking about a continuous glucose monitor like Dexcom or Libre, stuff like that.
Excellent. There's obviously two types of blood glucose monitoring. One is finger pricks and one is continuous glucose monitoring. When I started this for myself 13 years ago, continuous glucose monitoring really wasn't an option, especially for a person with type 2 diabetes. Instead, what I used was finger pricks.
Yeah.
Okay. And you have to use them systematically. So there's all sorts of studies demonstrating that finger pricks, blood glucose readings are not useful for patients with type 2 diabetes. And that's why the VA doesn't even provide finger stick blood glucose monitoring for its patients. However, the issue is if you use blood glucose monitoring systematically to provide you information, then it is very, very important. And so what I mean by systematically, if you measure your blood glucose before you eat and 2 hours later, and you consistently do this with different food groups, that will educate you as to which foods raise your blood glucose up a lot and which foods do not raise your blood glucose up a lot. And then you learn which menus work for you and which ones don't. For example, I can drink an all-day IPA, measure my blood glucose, and it may go up 10 points. But if I drink a citrus IPA, it may go up 170 points. And so with that information, I can learn, well, I can afford an all-day IPA, but I can't afford a citrus IPA.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask you, the experience I have with continuous glucose monitoring is my son who has type 1. Very different situation. And we always felt like, sure, different things affect him in a different way, but just about every carb is going to spike him up if it's not covered by insulin. Very different with people with type 2. Have you found in all of your time doing this study that there really is a difference for people, say, eating 20 grams of a large apple and 20 grams of a cupcake? Right. Can you talk a little bit about the difference that people find with those excursions and different foods? Because I think some people are listening going, a carb is a carb. It doesn't really matter. I went to a diabetes conference earlier this year and I saw something I knew I needed to tell you about. It's called CeQur Simplicity, and it's a game changer in insulin delivery. It's like a wearable insulin pen, a patch that's water resistant, thin, and lightweight. Best of all, it seamlessly fits into your lifestyle. For many of you, remembering your supplies or the hassle of injections is a daily challenge. Now you can say goodbye to mealtime injections. With CeQur Simplicity, you only fill what you need for 3 days, and it can be worn discreetly under your clothing, making dosing a breeze. If you're on long-acting insulin, you'll still take that shot once a day, but your mealtime insulin will always be with you. Find out more, go to clickinsulin.com. That is clickinsulin.com.
Different carbohydrates affect our blood glucose differently, and different gut biomes of individual patients affect blood glucose differently. So, for example, if I eat a keto bread that has 20 grams of carbohydrates and 20 grams of fiber versus another whole wheat piece of bread that has 20 grams of carbohydrates and only 1 gram of fiber, they will have very different effects on my blood glucose. And that's because fiber is a carbohydrate, but it's a non-digestible carbohydrate, so it won't raise your blood glucose. A general rule of thumb for a person with type 2 diabetes is you look at the nutrient labels of a food and look for total carbohydrate, and of course that includes sugar, so don't worry about sugar, because that's already in total carbohydrates. And a lot of people get hung up on, I got to avoid sugar. Well, it's carbohydrates that you're concerned about. And then you subtract the grams of fiber from grams of total carbohydrates, and that gives you net carbohydrates. And net carbohydrates are what push your blood glucose up. So if you take net carbohydrates and multiply it by 4, you'll get an approximate estimate of how much that food will raise your blood glucose.
Oh, interesting.
So if you have a piece of keto bread and you read the nutrient labels and it says 20 grams of carbohydrates and 20 grams of fiber, in effect, that slice of bread isn't going to raise your blood glucose at all. If you have a slice of regular wheat bread that has 21 grams of carbohydrates and 1 gram of fiber, you subtract the 1 from the 21, you get 20, you multiply it by 4, and that one slice of bread will raise your blood glucose approximately 80 points. So different carbohydrates have different effects on blood glucose. The other thing is that different people's biology will respond differently to the same foods. So with that information from systematic blood glucose monitoring, an individual can learn which foods for them are expensive, that is, push their blood glucose up a lot, and which ones are not.
So that answers the question about finger sticking. You did mention continuous glucose monitoring, which I would imagine gives you a much more full picture. Is that
exactly?
That's part of what I would assume if people's insurance cover that you would recommend that instead?
Yeah, if they can afford, or if their insurance company covers continuous glucose monitoring. And as I say that, I'm putting my hand on my arm and I'm feeling my blood glucose sensor that I'm currently wearing. And you're right, that tells you a lot more information about how fast the blood glucose goes up, how long it goes up, when it starts to come down, and how quickly it comes down. So if you can get access to continuous glucose monitoring, that gives you much more information. And so we talk about continuous blood glucose monitoring as doing four things. It educates, activates, motivates, and allows you to investigate. So it educates you as to what foods push your blood glucose up a lot or a little, and what types of physical activity brings your blood glucose down a lot or a little. It motivates you. So if you see that, like the example I gave earlier, I go out and take a walk after I eat those zucchini French fries and it drops my blood glucose. That motivated me to keep going and to bring it down even lower. It activates you. So if you see that your blood glucose is low, well, you may want to eat. Or if you see your blood glucose is already high, then maybe you want to postpone your meal. Or maybe you want to engage in some type of physical activity. The fourth thing is that it allows you to investigate. And on the internet, on television, you see all these claims about what lowers your blood glucose, has all this protein. Well, be a skeptic and test it out. So measure your blood glucose before and after you eat this food product pill and see if it works for you. So, for example, I was at an American Diabetes Association meeting, and there was this researcher from Spain who was talking about eating chocolate and how chocolate eaten an hour after you wake up lowers your blood glucose about 15 to 20% throughout the day.
Oh, I like this.
And I thought, well, it was a female investigator.
I like this lady.
And I said, yeah, fat chance. So that, like many other claims, I've tested on myself. And it turns out that it did lower my blood glucose about 15 to 20% if you eat it an hour after you get up. And so now I routinely have dark chocolate, just 2 grams, not a huge amount, about 2 hours after I wake up. So that's the benefit of continuous glucose monitoring. It can educate, activate, motivate, and allow you to investigate.
That's fantastic. And then it looks to me like the last part of the GEMS program is text messaging or communicating with medical professionals. Talk to me a little bit about what that entails and what the text messages said.
Okay. So in our current study, we're all busy, right? And we all get things, dealing with family members, dealing with jobs or whatever. And we may have the best intentions, but that doesn't mean we think about that at the time we're supposed to be doing something. And so what our program also includes is text messages to individuals about making healthy food choices and making choices about physical activity. And so what happens is we talk to the patients, we have this list of text messages, and we say, well, would any of these be helpful for you to receive on a regular basis? And are there other text messages that you would prefer or you would like to add? And at what time of the day are you making a decision that would be relevant to that text message? So, for example, text messages around food choices. I might say, well, I pack my lunch about 8:30 at night. Mm-hmm. So maybe that would be a great time for me to receive that text message because it would help me, remind me to think about, well, what kind of foods do I want to pack for lunch? Or maybe you want it, right before you prepare supper. And so maybe 5:30 would be a good time for that text message. So individuals can not only select what messages they receive, but when those messages would be most useful. And so they get text messages about food choices and about physical activities and about doing daily recordings of their experiences. Now, one thing I'd like to get back to is exercise. And so, like I said, there's two sides to the curve. One is preventing your blood glucose from going up with food choices. And this is relevant whether you're on medications or just managing yourself by lifestyle intervention. Of course, the more your blood glucose goes up, the more the intervention you need to bring it back down. So the more milligrams of a medication you need or whatever. The downside of the curve is, how do I bring it down quickly? So physical activity is a key component of the GEM intervention, because that's what empowers the individual to bring their blood glucose down. And there are two types of physical activity. One is walking, keeping moving. And that physical activity, especially when done after you eat, will help consume blood glucose and bring your blood glucose down. The other type of physical activity is moderate to vigorous physical activity, and it not only brings your blood glucose down, but it also reduces your insulin resistance, allowing your insulin to work better throughout the next 24 to 36 hours. So we're focusing on preventing your blood glucose from going up a lot in the first place, and when it goes up, which it will, how to bring it back down quickly.
Let me ask you this. We're right before Thanksgiving here.
Right.
So what would be the GEMS plan for Thanksgiving? I mean, this is a real excursion of a meal. And we're not expecting perfection, but kind of sketch it out. What are you going to do?
Well, this is a beautiful thing about GEM. It doesn't require a whole lot of modification. Thanksgiving, there may be turkey, there may be ham, there may be corn dressing, there's green beans, there's sweet potatoes, maybe there's pecan pie.
There's everything. We could list it for an hour.
And that's it. There's everything. So you can choose. You don't have to eat everything. So you eat your turkey. You eat your green beans. You eat your ham. You just select those foods that don't push your blood glucose up. And there's a huge variety of foods out there. But on the other hand, of course, you are not eating that sweet potato pie, or you are not eating those baked potatoes, but you're getting filled on other things. So it does take discipline in terms of making food selections, but you don't go hungry. In fact, you'll push away from that Thanksgiving table bloated just like the rest of us, but bloated with stuff that is healthier for you.
Is there a way, and I'm not trying to get away with anything, but let's say people are human beings and they just want a bite of stuffing, or they're going to have a little bit of that sweet potato pie. If you go for a walk in the morning, maybe, or you go for a more physical exercise the day before, you had mentioned how that will, increase your body's ability to use insulin, a walk after Thanksgiving dinner. Let's just say we didn't stick to the lower carb stuff. Can we make up for it in different ways with that exercise you mentioned?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a great fan of pecan pie.
Okay, I'm just making sure you were human. I wanted to make sure we weren't going for perfection here.
And so, you got two things with pecan pie. You got the crust, and then you got the stuffing. And, of course, both of them raise your blood glucose. And so I'll take a sliver, not a whole piece, but a half a piece of pecan pie. And then I'll eat the filling, but not the crust. Now, even that will push my blood glucose up significantly. And so then we get the family takes a traditional post-Thanksgiving walk. And we did this long before I developed diabetes, but it's just to deal with that bloatedness that you frequently have. The worst thing to do is to get stuffed and then just collapse in a recliner and stay there for the next 3 hours where you're snoozing or watching a football game. Because what's going on then is your blood glucose is just rising and rising and staying up for a sustained period. But like you said, you don't have to, you can choose to do that, or you can choose to try to bring your not to let your blood glucose go up as high as it could and bring it back down with physical activity.
This was a small pilot program that I read about, but now you're looking for more large-scale clinical trials. Can you talk a little bit about, are you recruiting? Are you looking for folks? What's next for this program?
Well, we've been investigating this approach for the last 13 years. And more recently, we have focused on people who are newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. That is, people who have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes for 12 months or less. And our goal is to allow these people to go into remission. That is, their A1C is less than 6.5. Now, that doesn't mean their diabetes has gone away. That just means that their blood glucose is in a normal range.
Right.
And of course, once you stop the program, your blood glucose will go back up. So it's a matter of creating a lifestyle that incorporates the things that we've been talking about. So with our current study, which is being conducted both at the University of Colorado and the University of Virginia, we are recruiting people who have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes within the last 12 months. These individuals get a comprehensive assessment at the beginning, 4.5 months later, and 13.5 months later. So we're looking at short-term and long-term impacts, and for which they get compensated $300. Then half of the people will receive the GEM intervention, which includes continuous glucose monitors, the training manual, and Fitbits and text messages, etc. These individuals, the GEM intervention, people do not have to come to either institution. That's a self-administered
That was my next
program.
question, right? No travel.
No travel. There is travel coming for those 3 assessments. So we have people coming from all over who are willing to come to Charlottesville, Virginia for those 3 assessments. But the treatment intervention is self-administered.
We will link up the information in our show notes to make sure if you're interested, you can get in touch. But before I let you go, you mentioned you were diagnosed with type 2 13 years ago. Is it hard for you to maintain all of this?
No, it's a lifestyle. And because it's a lifestyle, it's the thing I do every day. It's not a diet. It's not something I'm going to do for a little bit, and then once I get to a point, it's over. And so what has happened, and God bless my wife, who was very skeptical at the beginning and, kind of resenting it early on because I was changing my diet, and I was changing my physical activity. But now what has happened is she loves to have this healthier husband, and she herself is healthier because we're going through this dietary. We do water aerobics together. We plan menus together. It's a very positive experience. So no, it's not an issue at all at this point in time.
One thing I did want to ask, you mentioned at the very beginning of this that weight loss as a goal is very tough, right? It's not maintainable. It's very difficult. People get very frustrated. But everything you talked about sounds to me making lower carb choices, exercising more, that it would naturally lead to weight loss. Is that not the case?
It is the case. Thank you for bringing that up. We published one study several years ago where we compared the CDC weight loss program to the GEM intervention. And we're not focusing on weight loss with the GEM intervention, but just like you said, they're more physically active and reducing the carbohydrate. And what we found was that the people who went through the GEM program actually lost more weight than the people who went through the Center for Disease Control weight loss program. And further, what was interesting is when we did 24-hour dietary recall, we did not see these people increase their fat intake. They did not increase their protein intake, but in fact, they did decrease their carbohydrate intake. And that's, why they lost weight, we think. One important point, which I alluded to, is that because this is a lifestyle, this can involve the people around you. And the people around you can be supportive or problematic. So you really want to get the people around you in sync and on your side. And by that, I don't mean to be carbohydrate police and telling you what to eat and what not to eat, but supportive and engaging with you and becoming curious and seeing how they can help promote things for you. So, for example, my wife is always online looking for low carbohydrate desserts. We just had a dinner party the other day, and she made this wonderful dessert, and it didn't affect my blood glucose. And the other people who don't have diabetes, they enjoyed it as well. So there's the partner is central to this. Now, you can do it without a supportive partner, but it's much more difficult.
Sure. What was the dessert? I'll have to look this one up.
My wife comes up with all these things, But you can Google keto desserts, and you need to look at the nutrient content, how many net carbohydrates are in there. But those will frequently give you a lot of good options.
Well, thank you so much for joining me to talk about all this. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited that the study is open. As I said, we'll link up the information in the show notes. But Dr. Cox, thanks for spending so much time with me and my listeners. I appreciate it.
Great. Well, I'm glad to be here and glad to reach out and share what has worked for me and hopefully will work with many others.
More information about GEMS and the study in the show notes. If you're listening in a podcast app, just scroll down a little bit. They should be there. If you have any trouble, just head over to this episode's homepage at diabetes-connections.com. Just make sure you're looking at the Type 2 show. Right now, my original Diabetes Connections podcast, which focuses more on Type 1, and this one are all on the same website. We're working on that. Thank you for your patience. And we'll have more episodes about food and maybe, those keto desserts coming up as well. We've got a lot to cover here, but I'm always a little reluctant, I'll be honest with you, to talk too much about food because it's such an individual thing. And I'm not crazy about people who believe that their way is the only way, but I know it can be really helpful. So we'll thread that needle in the episodes to come. And it's a good time to bring a quick housekeeping note here. We will have our In the News episode in a couple of days. I do every other Friday. I do an In the News episode, which is all about headlines and stories in the diabetes community, all types of diabetes. But then we're going to take a break until January. This episode is the last of a limited series that we had planned for Diabetes Connections Type 2 to kind of dip a toe in the water with a new podcast. But it's going great. We will definitely be back. So please subscribe or follow for free wherever you listen, and the next episodes will come straight to you. If you're listening to a podcast app, there's probably a plus sign somewhere or a way to make sure you can subscribe or follow. This show is always free, very easy to do, and that way you don't have to do any extra work or wonder when the next episode's coming in. In January, it'll come straight to you. Thanks to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions, and thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I will see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.
It can be pretty tricky to travel with insulin, especially if you're going somewhere very cold or somewhere very hot. We have found something that really works well for us, and that is the VIVI Cap from Tempramed. It keeps your insulin at the exact right temperature, even in the extreme heat or cold, and it works for any insulin pen. Super simple. You just take the cap off your insulin pen and you slide the VIVI Cap on. No batteries, no charging, no water or ice packs. It lasts for years and gives you 24/7, 365 protection because insulin is very temperature sensitive. VIVI Cap has a 30-day, 100% money-back guarantee, and it's got a 2-year warranty. Find out more. I've got a link in the show notes for you, or you can go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Tempramed VIVI Cap logo.